beginning of the conflict, Great Britain dominates the sea and applies the blockade to besiege Germany in the North Sea. German units attack the convoys. The British Air Force reacts vigorously. Since the German sea power is inferior, they cannot engage in naval battles. They are trapped in the North Sea. The Luftwaffe helps with supportive action and protection when the convoys are attacked. Only later, after the conquest of Norway, will Germany have an outlet to the open sea. From the beginning of the conflict, minor engagements are frequent along the seashores. The German Navy fights with camouflaged warships, their effectiveness having already been proven in the First World War. Small, medium, and long-range submarines are added. The submarines, which can force the British blockade, operate in all seas and inflict heavy damage to the British Navy and the convoys which supply Great Britain. The ambush is concentrated in points where the convoys must pass on their way toward Great Britain, with attacks either by torpedoes while submerged or with gunfire when surfaced. The British Navy, which dominates the sea, attacks the German merchant fleet far from home. Wherever possible, the Luftwaffe attacks the British formations. With the conquest of France, the Germans have an excellent base on the Atlantic at Bordeaux, from where the Italian long-range submarines also operate, including the Barbarigo under the command of Grassi. The German and Italian submarines push near to the coast of the United States. The opening of the Russian front forces the Germans to transfer several submarines to the Arctic Ocean in order to intercept the Allied convoys moving toward Murmansk. The technique of the German underwater fleet improves. Supplies and repairs can be done on the open sea. The German Navy, under the command of Grand Admiral Raeder, passes to the command of Admiral Donitz, who emphasizes submarine warfare. New methods are studied, small craft with explosives and one-man submarines, similar to the Italian ones. However, their actions are not too effective. With Italy entering the conflict and the African campaign, the Mediterranean becomes a theater of naval operations. The route toward Libya can be secured only after having neutralized the powerful British base at Malta. Because of continuous air attacks by the Italian-German Air Force, Malta can no longer serve as a base for the British Navy. On the Libyan front, the war continues with alternating fortunes. The convoys with supplies and troops traveling from Italy toward Africa need a constant escort. Major naval encounters between the Italian and British fleets in the Mediterranean Sea take place in 1940 at Punto Stilo, Cape Spada, and Cape Talata. In 1941 at Cape Malapan and Sirte. In 1942, the Second Battle of the Sirte takes place, as well as the Battle of Pantelleria. In some of these encounters, the radar used by the British determines the results. In order to improve their inferiority to the British Navy, the Italians adapt other means of attack, from the famous pigs to small craft, to pocket submarines, which attack the ports of Ceuta, Malta, Gibraltar, and Alexandria. The British, in turn, use aircraft to attack the Italian battleships in the port of Taranto. The American intervention will be decisive for the naval battles and for the escort of convoys. In spite of being heavily engaged in the Orient, the United States is sending enormous forces, and their support will decide the outcome of the year-long fight between construction and destruction. Winter 1943. Leningrad, second largest city in Russia, has been besieged for 13 months, and food is scarce. Although subjected to continuous bombing from land and air, the population resists fiercely. People die on the streets from hunger and cold, but nobody thinks of surrender. The Russian Navy, anchored on the islands of Kronstadt, answers the German gunfire with broadside salvos. On January 18, 1943, the Russians counterattack and occupy Petrokrpost. All is quiet on the whole immense front, from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, until July, when the Russians, after having neutralized a German preventive offensive, attacked the salient of Oriel. The retreating Germans adopt the tactic of scorched earth, blowing up the bridges and destroying everything. The Russian offensive begins on the whole front. There are gigantic battles at Orel, Kursk, and Kharkov. In the south, in the sectors of Kuban and Donetsk, the Russians advance like an irresistible avalanche, reach the Dnieper, and occupy Kiev on November 6th. Farther north, the Russians occupy Gomel on November 25 and spread out in the swamps of Pripyat. A wave of destruction and death passes across the martyred Russian land for a second time. The partisans help the Soviet troops everywhere. They fight courageously, even though they know their destiny if captured by the Germans. "12,000 Polish officers, shot in the neck, are found in the ditches near Katyn. In December 1943, the Russians attacked the German forces installed in the lower Dnieper to defend the mining resources of Krivoy Rog. The battle lasts all winter. Leningrad, though still besieged, is able to receive supplies from across the frozen Lake Ladoga and thus overcome hunger. The Russian Air Force, now of high quality, makes itself felt in the battles. On January 14, 1944, two perfectly synchronized Russian offensives are released to liberate Leningrad. One from inside the city under the command of General Govorov, another from the front of Volkov under the command of General Meretskov. The Battle of Chidovo finishes with a German defeat. The new front is now 100 miles from Leningrad. There now is action on the whole front. In the center, near the marshes of Pripyat, the Russians press the rear guard of the retreating Germans. Once again, the retreating Germans destroy the railroads and everything behind them, applying the tactic of scorched earth. The High Soviet Command plans the future advances, which will bring the Russians beyond the old Russian border. Crimea is liberated by the Russians in the middle of April. On May 9th, the Russians enter Sevastopol and take the whole garrison prisoner. The Italian crew of their pocket submarine had retreated earlier toward Constanta, either on their own power or on Romanian ships. The Allies, now holding the bases in North Africa, intensify their attacks on the cities and ports of southern Italy. General Eisenhower, commanding the Mediterranean forces, plans to land in Sicily. On July 3, 1943, the invasion fleet is directed toward the shores of Sicily. The reaction of the Italian-German Air Force is immediate, but the difference between the opposing forces is great, and the Allied pilots have the upper hand. Large formations fly over the sky of Sicily and drop paratroops. This operation, with the objective of occupying the airports, is opposed and neutralized by Italian-German land forces. The result of the amphibious operation, undertaken by the Allies with 2,775 transport ships, 280 warships, 4,000 aircraft, and 160,000 men, is quite different. After intensive air and naval bombardment, the landing force occupies the terrain on July 3, 1943. There are two debarkation areas, the American between Licata and Pozzolo, and the British between Cap Passero and Syracuse. Although in some places the defensive Italian-German reaction is intense and fierce, the defensive coastal forces between Syracuse and Augusta retreat and partially surrender. The Americans expand from Gela and Licata toward Palermo. After the bombardment of Rome on July 19th, Pope Pius XII visits the populations of the places hit. On July 25th, after a violent session of the Great Council, King Vittorio Emanuele III arrests Mussolini and charges Marshal Badoglio with the formation of a new government. The Allies intensify the bombing. Badoglio begins secret meetings for surrender. The cities most hit are Milan, Turin, and Genoa. The people are disoriented and tired. On September 8th, the radio announces the conclusion of an armistice. For a moment, everyone thinks that the nightmare is over. On the contrary, this is the beginning of the most tragic period for Italy. The dispositions of the High Command are confusing. The king and the government of Badoglio flee to Brindisi, leaving a chaotic situation and an order to oppose eventual German actions. Rome, left to itself, has no coordinated action for defense. The Italian army is dissolved. Everybody plans to return home. The formation which resists the Germans is disarmed and deported. The Italian troops stationed abroad, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, without precise directions from Rome, act on their own, either for or against the Germans. The WWII division in Cephalonia, which does not surrender to the Germans, is decimated. 400 officers and 8,000 soldiers are killed. On September 8th, at the same time as the armistice is announced, the Anglo-American forces begin their Operations Avalanche, with landing in Salerno, which according to their plans should lead shortly to the occupation of all Italy. Hitler, reacting immediately and violently on July 25th, has sent, under the command of General Kesselring, a great force which opposes the Allies and retards their advance. On September 12th, a platoon of German parachutists liberates Mussolini, held prisoner on the Gran Sasso. He meets in Germany with Hitler. He will later form the Social Italian Republic. After having broken the resistance around Salerno, the Allies head toward Naples, where the population has revolted against the Germans. In order to accelerate the advance toward Rome, the Allies plan a landing at Anzio. The Germans respond to the Allied naval gunfire with long-range artillery fire, mounted on railway cars. The German defense of the coast is fierce. After several battles, the bridgehead becomes stabilized. Fresh troops arrive. The battle is furious around Cassino. Italian troops are fighting on both sides, with the forces of the government of Badoglio and with the Social Italian Republic. Italy is divided in two, both territorially and ideologically. Partisans emerge in the zone occupied by Germans. On April 22, 1944, Hitler and Mussolini meet near Salzburg, Austria. After the fall of Cassino, the Germans retreat to the north. The Allies advance toward Rome and arrive in Rome on June 14th. Once again, it seems that Germany is defeated and that all national territory will pass into the hands of the Allies under the command of General Clark. However, Kesselring still has another natural bulwark, the Gothic Line. In August 1944, Churchill visits the Allied troops in Italy. While the attack on the Gothic Line begins, encounters between the troops of the Social Italian Republic and the partisans take place. The Germans round up partisans and execute them in reprisal. The Allies advance further into the valleys of the Apennines and along the Adriatic, and arrive in Rimini, Forlì, and Cesena. The partisans cooperate with the Allies. After the winter quiet on the front in the Apennines, The great Allied offensive begins in the spring of 1945. After breaking the last German resistance, the Allies reach Bologna and advance into the valley of the Po River. In several places in the north, the partisans fight and overcome the German forces prior to the arrival of the Allies. The commander of the German SS, General Wolf, signs the surrender. Mussolini and members of his government are captured and shot by the partisans. The people mass in Milan, in Piazza Cerreto. The war in Italy is finished, but the Italian people have a long and difficult road ahead. In the winter of 1943-44, Marshal Rommel is called to command the Atlantic Wall, built by Germans, which extends from the coast of Holland to the Spanish border. The mighty fortification has been planned to neutralize any attempt of landing by the Allies. In Great Britain, the Allies have assembled enormous numbers of men and material. On June 5, 1944, General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, gives the order to attack the next day. Tens of thousands of landing craft move toward the coast of Normandy. Alarmed, the Germans prepare themselves for defense. Nobody believes that a landing in the nearby fortified sector is possible. As formations en route in the Channel are sighted, the coastal artillery opens an intense fire, to which the Allied Navy responds. The landing operations also include divisions to send troops behind the German lines and to drop entire divisions of paratroops. It is the greatest invasion armada in history. 3 divisions are transported by air into France. The reaction from the ground is prompt. In some areas of Holland, the dikes are opened, flooding the entire region so that an eventual invasion will be impossible. 4,000 ships, 7 battleships, 13 cruisers, and hundreds of minesweepers are ready to create several bridgeheads in Normandy. Tens of thousands disembark from landing craft under intense German fire. The tanks land immediately. "11,000 bombers and attack planes support the great offensive. In the sky, on the sea, on land, it is a deluge of fire. The bridgeheads enlarge and meet. The fortress of Cherbourg is conquered. The Battle of Normandy is won, and the Allied troops spread south and east toward Paris. The German resistance, at first chaotic and disorganized, stiffens and becomes organized, but is quickly overrun. General Montgomery is in command of the land forces. The Germans attempt to stop the advance in several places, but the French partisans, supplied by air by the Allies, organize sabotage actions. War and destruction once again fall on French territory. The Allied Air Force bombards the strongholds where the Germans are assembled. Another landing in the Provence causes the conquest of Toulon and Marseille. What the Air Force has not destroyed is blown up by the mines of the retreating German troops. France is quickly given up. In the north, however, the Germans stiffen and organize a front to defend German territory. On August 19th, the National Council of Resistance gives the partisans the order of insurrection. The French, having already organized partisan formations, respond to this appeal and fight in the streets, while in the meantime, the American troops arrive. The German garrisons surrender. On August 25th, General de Gaulle and his officers, the heads of the resistance, and Allied commanders marched through the streets of Paris. General Eisenhower's first great battle is concluded. In June of 1944, the great Russian offensive begins between Vitebsk and Mogilev on a 150-mile front. Supported by 15,000 artillery pieces, the Soviet troops break through and overrun the German defenses pointing toward Minsk in the Great Battle of Berezina. Minsk falls on July 3rd. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners are taken in different pockets. Industrial plants and roads of communication are destroyed by the Germans. Simultaneously, with the great offensive on the entire front, from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea, the militarily organized Russian and Polish forces operate behind the German lines. For the Germans, it is no longer a fight on a single front. Manpower becomes scarce in Germany. Hitler forms the Volkssturm, the People's Army, for the last defense of the Reich by a general mobilization of all men over the age of 16. Even youngsters 12 to 16 years old take up arms. Himmler assumes command of the new formation. A desperate defense is organized by the Germans at the borders of their territory. At Goldap and Nemmensdorf, the Russians step foot on German soil for the first time. The population of East Prussia flees toward the west. Advancing to Galicia, the Russians reach Leopoli and liberate the prisoners from concentration camps. On the southern front, with a sweeping advance, the Russian troops reach Iasi, Galati, Constanta, and Bucharest, where King Mikhail concludes an armistice and declares war on Germany. Moving south with a relentless advance, the Russians reach Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and the borders of Greece. In the fall, the Germans retreat toward Budapest, which is besieged by the Russians on December 9th and falls on February 13th, 1945. On January 12th, 1945, the Russians launch the winter offensive and overrun the German army, Group A, under the command of General Harpe. Warsaw falls the 17th of January. It is the great defeat of the German army. From February 3rd to the 12th, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet at Yalta in the Crimea, where they make plans for the rapid conclusion of the war and consider programs for after the war. The Russians continue their winter advance to the rivers Oder and Nisa in the heart of Germany, where the Germans organize what will be their last line of resistance. On March 12th, the forces of Zhukov cross the Oder, while the army of Konev, having crossed the Nisa, meets with the American forces coming from the west. The goal of the Russians is Berlin. A triple defense ring is created around the German capital. The Russians break through from everywhere, and the capital is surrounded. The fierce German resistance is not enough to stop the Soviet troops, which enter the suburbs. Over 500,000 Germans fight in Berlin. It is an inferno of fire and steel, a fight from house to house. It is also the last tragic hour for the civil population, which has suffered for years from terrible privations and has been subjected to continuous bombardments. Hitler, a few chiefs, and the commanders of the Wehrmacht lived through the last tragic moments of the tragedy of the Third Reich in the bunker of the Chancellery. On May 2nd, Berlin surrenders. German people have paid with millions of deaths for the errors of the war. The Russians have lost over 10 million people. Now, all is finished. Having air supremacy, the Allies hammer repeatedly at the more important German industrial centers. The German anti-air defense is of little help. The damage and destruction of cities and plants is irreparable. Berlin is subjected to uninterrupted bombings, which increase as the Russian troops approach. After the occupation of Alsace-Lorraine, all of France passes into Allied hands. The German counterattack in the Ardennes, where Hitler has thrown all his forces, fails. The Allies break through and overrun the front near the Rhine, while in the east, the Russians advance toward the German frontier. Pressed between the two pincers, the Germans put their last hope in their secret weapons, the V-1 and the V-2, already used in the air attacks on London. Some of these bombs are intercepted and made harmless by the Allies before they can hit the port of Antwerp, which had fallen intact into the Allies' hands. The few German ships that saved themselves from Allied attacks are now hit with every available means. The defense of Cologne, whose periphery was reached by the Anglo-Americans on March 5, 1945, is fierce. After 4 days of fighting, Cologne surrenders. The Rhine, the only natural obstacle to the advancing Allies, is crossed by the American spearhead at Remagen, where they find the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge intact. The Rhine is also crossed elsewhere with amphibious craft. The progress of the advancing troops is closely followed by Churchill, Eisenhower, and Montgomery. The armored columns are spread and penetrate toward the heart of Germany. Frankfurt, Münster, Düsseldorf, and Stuttgart fall. There are white flags everywhere. The Anglo-American and Russian Air Force have no opposition. The remainder of the Luftwaffe is systematically destroyed. The Allies submit the unoccupied zones to intensive bombardment, while the population lives almost continuously in shelters. Continuous bombing is extended to the areas which the Russians are about to occupy. The Anglo-Americans stop after having reached the banks of the Elbe. They will meet there with the Soviet troops advancing from the east. Germany has collapsed. During their last advance, the Allies discover the horrible German extermination camps. It is here where the racist doctrine planned for millions of innocents to die. Hitler has disappeared in the bunker of the Chancellery. Jodl and von Friedeberg signed the unconditional surrender of Germany on orders from Donitz in Reims on May 7, 1945. Eisenhower, who has brought with him 2 fountain pens with the precise goal of using them to sign the German capitulation, fulfills his pledge. The war in Europe is finished. Stalin, Truman, and Attlee, the Big Three, meet in Potsdam to discuss the new order of the world. December 7th, 1941. Without warning, Japan attacks the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The United States is taken by complete surprise. The damage is considerable. Over 400 planes and almost all of the 88 ships in the harbor are either damaged or destroyed. In a very short time, Japan occupies almost a fourth of the Earth's surface. Since Japan has signed a military pact with Germany and Italy, the Axis are now at war with the United States. Hong Kong, an important British military base, is attacked by Japan from land, sea, and air, and capitulates on November 25, 1941. The Japanese advance through the jungles of Malaysia and reach Singapore, which capitulates on February 15, 1942. Through a series of rapid and successful attacks, Japan extends its front from the Carolines to the Gilbert Islands, to the Marshalls, Philippines, and the Dutch Indies. The Allies, faced by overwhelming sea and air power, retreat on all fronts. On March 8th, the Japanese launch an attack on New Guinea, 2,500 miles from their native land. It is a direct menace to Australia. With a tremendous effort, the Allies managed to stop the invasion of New Guinea. In China, where the Japanese had been fighting since 1937, they now control the railroads from Singapore to Manchuria. The course of the conflict, however, is rapidly changing. The United States, having reorganized its forces, begins a series of operations in the Coral Sea and reoccupies Guadalcanal after 12 successful naval engagements. With air and naval supremacy, the Allies counterattack and reconquer important strategic bases in the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marshall Islands and from the Carolines to the Marianne Islands. Roosevelt and Churchill have their second meeting in Quebec from September 11th to the 16th in 1944 and agree on a plan to invade Japan. The Allies land on the island of Leyte in September 1944, the first step to the reconquest of the Philippine Islands. Jungle fighting is fierce and bloody. The Japanese fight to the last man. However, their sacrifice is in vain. The Philippine Islands are the last bastion of resistance for the land of the rising sun. In 3 major naval engagements around the Philippine Islands, Allied naval supremacy defeats the Japanese Navy. After the naval disasters, the Japanese adopt suicidal methods of warfare with their kamikaze pilots and mini-subs. But these last suicidal measures are not enough to stop the Allied victories. The Allies, with naval and air supremacy, tighten up their circle of fire around Japan. On February 19th, 1945, American Marines land on Iwo Jima, the doorway to Japan. On March 26th, they invade the island of Kuruma. On April the 1st, they land on Okinawa. The last of the Japanese fighters on Okinawa are burned out of their pillboxes by American flamethrowers. As a symbol of victory, American Marines raise the stars and stripes on Okinawa. Stubbornly, Japan continues to fight. After American warnings, 2 atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The effect of atomic bombs induces the Japanese emperor to surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Second World War ends with the signing of Japan's unconditional surrender.